So let's get started. So the book is basically a journey, and we'll talk about the details of the book in a little more detail. But Charles, since I knew you in finance, and now you're a PhD student and a curator and a writer, what was the arc of your journey to get from finance to the art world?
Yeah, so the deep, dark past of the banker.
To the delight of the Northern Trust crowd.
Right,
yes,
right.
You can be reformed at any time.
Right. So in 10 years, wow, I'm old. So yeah, we met back in 2012-ish. I was in wealth management, you know, building my book of clients in asset management. And, you know, I like to look for clients organically. So I would go to places where I enjoyed what the event was. And at that time, I was really into art and watch collecting and wine. And so we met at an event that was hosted by Danielle, I believe. And, you know, how lucky are you to go to Danielle, a 3-star Michelin restaurant, at noon and start drinking into the late hours of the night. So that was a great time. But I was more into art than watches and wine, honestly. And so over the years, I started to collect in 2012 as well. But I got more into art than I was into finance. And I remember I would just be thinking about the art show I just attended and this artwork I just bought. And at that time, I just really thought it was really important to do the thing that I loved and the thing that I was passionate about. And, you know, it wasn't so soon, but I would say by 2016, I checked out mentally. And so by 2017, I'd started my second master's at Harvard, and I was studying museum studies, trying to figure out what I was going to do after I left my employer. And so I graduated in 2019, and I spent the summer deciding what I was going to do in this art world. And initially, I spent a lot of money on lawyer fees to start a hedge fund investing in art, which I no longer did. So I emailed one of the editors at ArtNet my master's thesis, and he got back to me in 2 days and said, I showed this to my boss, and he said, I need to meet you immediately. So fast forward, we met, and the first article I ever published was an exhibition review on Ed Clark, which is also going to be the subject of my doctoral dissertation studies.
That's great. So we're glad you're here in the art world now. We embrace you. And so the book starts out basically where you talk a bit about the cultural meaning of color, what the colors red, green, blue mean to different cultures, not only in America, but also globally. And then the book closes with a more in-depth, say, scholarly discussion of color theory, focusing on Joseph Albers, and also kind of the pigment black and how even like impressionists like Edward Manet uses black. And I think Renoir calls black the queen of all colors. So I was thinking, like, we have almost like this arc that to me was like a rainbow. Like, we start with a chapter on black at the beginning. We go through this arc of meeting collectors and artists, and then we end with a discussion of black. What made you choose that kind of a narrative arc for the structure of the book?
Well, first I'd like to talk about like how I just came to the title of the book. And my first book was called The Black Market, A Guide to Art Collecting, which I thought was pretty straightforward aside from the slight wordplay on the black market. But at that moment when I was working on this book, I was watching a video about a Damien Hirst piece called The Physical Impossibility of Death Through the Mind of Someone Living. And I thought, wow, that's a great title for just a shark.
It's the shark and formaldehyde piece, the infamous one.
Right.
For that.
So I wanted my book title to sort of mimic that complex notion of color. So I titled the book The Brilliance of the Color Black Through the Eyes of Art Collectors. And I've been obsessed with color theory. And so throughout the book, you'll see me weaving in stories about the color black. And when I question collectors, I often ask them what was their relationship to the color black, not as it pertains to race, but as it pertains to the pigment and how artists uses the color black in their work. And so you'll see that narrative is kind of weaved throughout the book. And as you say, I begin with color theory, but then I think my love for color theory comes out in the final chapter called Black Brilliance, where I discuss the color black and its usage throughout art history from caveman era until present time. I won't say any more about that because I think you should read the book.
Yeah, and it's particularly beautiful writing. As an art historian, it was just gorgeous, gorgeous reading. So then the first chapter goes into, a bit surprisingly, a list of very important 20th century literature by black poets, some critical theory, some Toni Morrison bell hooks, like some names you'll recognize, others you might not be as familiar with. So why start an art book with literature? What was the impetus for that?
Well, I started my first book with literature as well, but I wanted to go deeper into the study of literature because I'm often fascinated by what informs and inspires artists, and often you'll hear artists talk about the other artists that inspire them, but I'm also more interested in what informs the artist. So when I interview artists, I often ask them what are they reading, and they're often shocked by that because no one asked them what they're reading, and so artists would tell me the literature that they're reading, that it informs their work. So that's why I included it in the book, and and also for a collector, in order to know more about the art and understand the artist, it's great to understand what informs the artist and what inspires them. And so I thought that was really good for collectors to understand.
Yeah. So then the next chapter is also another pivot because we're going from serious literature and Zadie Smith, one of my own favorites, to Chicago native Kanye West. I'm like, whoa, chapter on Kanye. In the Brilliance book, obviously most well known as a musician, and you specifically talk about his 2011 album Runaway and the 30-minute video that accompanies it. So again, I thought strategically, we're going from the written word to the musical word to visuals, all in one artist, so to speak. So why Kanye in the Brilliance book?
Well, I'm a Kanye West fan. But I'm a fan of video art, and I think video art is challenging for a collector to not only understand, but how do you actually collect it? So I thought it was important to sort of include something that maybe collectors could easily understand, and they could also easily go out and look at. And so, I was that video came out in 2010. At the time, I was living in Italy, and when the album dropped, I thought it might be interesting because I was around all these Italians who may or may not have understood, American culture and African American culture. So I decided to throw an album release party, which was the first time I'd ever done that.
Hottest party in Rome.
Right. But, interesting enough, the roommate I had at the time, we didn't have a television. We had a projector, and it projected onto this 300-inch screen. And I thought, this would be interesting to project this 35-minute video on loop while the album is playing in the background. and we just watched the video all night while the album was playing. My beautiful dark twisted fantasy, more darkness, I guess, right?
Lots of color and dancing,
Right.
and ballerinas too.
Right, and so I was thinking about that while I was writing this book, and I thought, you know, initially I wanted to break down the video, "Love is the Message is Love" by Arthur Jaffa, which also loops a Kanye West song, "Ultralight Beams," but I decided to do "Runaway" instead. The interesting thing about that video is the creative director is Vanessa Beecroft, which I'm a fan of, and you see her work in that video when the ballerina dancers are dancing in unison, but you also see her influence on Kanye in his fashion through his fashion shows. Every time he's done a fashion show, he has the models lined up in a way that you know it was informed by an artist, Vanessa Beecroft. And I thought that was interesting for collectors to understand and see that.
Yeah, that really is. And then, so in your next chapter, you start interviewing or discussing specific artists, and specifically not only the brilliance of the color black, but the importance of representation of the black figure, and introducing the black figure, or just depicting the black figure. And there are quite a few artists like Titus Gafford, Jordan Castile, and a few others. And coincidentally, a lot of them, Shabalala Self, I remember you and I had a big discussion about a few years ago. You're like, I love this artist. I can't get one of her works. I'm like, well, which artist? Which artist? And you're like, Shabalala Self. And I'm like, whoa, yeah, get on that list. But all these three names and quite a few other names, they all graduated from the MFA program at Yale. And so I guess one of my questions is when you were speaking to the artists, and especially, I guess, graduates of that program and graduates of other MFA programs as well, how did their graduate school kind of studies inform them, help them clarify their visual voice, their concepts? Did their training, what was the impact of their training? And did they articulate it at all as being incredibly relevant or important to their practice?
I don't know. Because one might ask, was it the artist that was great before they got to Yale, or were they great after they've had the Yale experience? And I don't know if I have the answer to that question. But I interviewed Shaba for my first book, and she was profiled in the black market, and she's a brilliant artist. And Yale has a history of graduating these brilliant artists. Even some others that are profiled in this book is Mario Moore, who's a portrait artist, and Alterance Gumby, who's showing at the fair at Karen Jenkins Johnson's booth. But there's other programs that turn out really brilliant artists, like Columbia University. Last year's class had Kahari Turner and Kevin Claiborne and Lindsay Britton Collins, who I'm a big fan of their work. But there's also like artists that are self-taught that are brilliant, So you have artists like Nate Lewis and Alvin Armstrong, who didn't go to art school, but they're brilliant artists.
We were talking before about color theory, and Joseph Albers, who's written some of the best books on color theory, actually taught at Yale. Any connection there, or we've spoken? You're a fan of Albers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with color theory right now. So, and I know that Albers has influenced a lot of the Yale artists, and I'm thinking of two in particular, Lucia Hero, who I don't think her work is directly influenced or by Joseph Albers, but the way she frames her work is definitely influenced by Joseph Albers, and she said that in interviews. But then also Dominic Chambers, his work is definitely influenced by Joseph Albers and his experience at Yale. He even has the After Albers series of portrait work that he does, and you clearly see the square colors that are surround the portrait in his work, and even if it's not titled after Albers, you know it's influenced by Joseph Albers.
Okay. One more Yale reference. One of my favorite graduates is Howardina Pindell, another black artist, but she actually doesn't focus on the black body as a subject matter. She's more what we would call conceptual. And just a shout out to the local Museum of Contemporary Art. They had a fantastic retrospective of Pindell's a few years ago. So in the chapter where you speak with a lot of the collectors, I didn't see many of the collectors discussing a lot of the black conceptual artists that are out there, not only Pindella, but also David Hammond's a very big one, and also Adrian Piper. You know, she was already working on this and thinking about like race and gender and constructs of that in the 60s and 70s. Is there more reticence, or is it just less sexy to collect conceptual black artists, or did any of the collectors articulate a position on that one way or the other?
No, but first off, I love Howardina Pindell. She was the second artist I interviewed. I interviewed her for Artsy back in 2020, and then I also interviewed her for a catalog essay in 2021. I love her work. But, you know, conceptual art is interesting, but, you know, how do you display a sound piece by Jenny Jones in your home? So, you know, I think collectors might have a challenge with how to display the art. And, you know, you look at around the fair, you don't see a whole lot of conceptual art. It's 4 square paintings on the wall. And then occasionally you might have a photograph, and occasionally you might have a sculpture, and then some conceptual art. So I interviewed probably about 50 collectors over the 2 books, and maybe another 10, for online journal publication. And no, conceptual art has never really come up. And, you know, unless you include like maybe Genevieve Gagnard, would she be considered a conceptual artist? You know, so, you know, Kent Kelly, which is a collector who is profiled in this particular book, he collects her work, and I think she might be considered a conceptual artist. But other than that, it doesn't really come up in conversation a lot.
Maybe I'll write that book, How to Hang an Idea. You heard the title here first, so someone needs to show some love to those conceptual artists. Let's focus now on the collectors, because that's such a strong part of the book. We really learn about the collecting journey of a variety of different collectors, and they all have a different journey. And I'm thinking about a collector that's not in there, but she's very, very vocal. Joyce, oh goodness, I'm escaping her name, out of San Francisco. Thank you, Pamela Joyner. Thank you. So, Pamela Joyner out of San Francisco. She considers herself an activist collector. She is black, her husband is white, and they have recently donated about 30 works to SF MoMA, specifically. Let's wait for that. She's donated over 30 works to SF MoMA specifically to increase the visibility of black artists and to help them with their collection, since it doesn't have enough representation. She's given TED Talks. She's done excellent interviews about this topic. As I said, she considers herself activist collector, capital A, capital C. With the collectors that you interviewed, who all have a very strong focus of collecting black artists, they're very passionate about it. Did they use that word to describe themselves? Do they consider themselves an activist with a capital A?
None of them use that term to describe themselves, but many of them are very much so activist collectors. I can think of a few off the top of my head, but like Ray McGuire, who's profiled in the book, who's on the Whitney Museum Board. He's also chair of the Studio Museum Board of Harlem. He's definitely an activist collector. He's not as vocal as Pam, But then you have collectors like Bernard Lumpkin, who has vocally used his voice and his resources and his power as a collector to help prop up artists, black artists in particular, and mostly African American artists in particular. He produced a book on his collection called Young, Gifted, and Black. He also has an exhibition with the same title, Young, Gifted, and Black. That's a traveling show that's entirely 100% works in his collection. And he was very vocal about why he did that. And it was specifically to bring to light these collectors that are or these artists that are in his collection, and have that exhibition travel across the country and possibly later on across the globe. And last time I talked to Bernard, that collection is booked out until 2025 for Young, Gifted, and Black.
That's great news. And you also have a really nice quote from Bernard in the book where he says, quote, "A collector keeps, a patron shares. A collector is private, a patron is public." Such a beautiful statement. Can you elaborate on what he's saying?
Well, that stemmed from a question I asked him. What was the difference between an art collector and an art patron? And that was his response. And that quote floated around, and I wrote about Bernard for Artsy as well, and I think that quote floated into that piece. But many collectors have pointed that quote out to me in the book, and it really changed the way they saw themselves. And so it was important for him to say that aloud and highlight that in the book.
It's offering the suggestion that I think all collectors operate from the point of passion. You have your taste, I have my taste, the audience has their taste. And he's saying it starts with that, but it can so go beyond that, and sharing it with the community and educating others. I thought his words were so lovely. And then another chapter, it's tucked into chapter 13, you already know what's coming. We're learning about artists, we're learning about various collectors, and then suddenly you pivot to collection management and how to manage your art assets, which is interesting and then afterwards we go back to, the beauty of the color black. So obviously Rebecca and I are excited that you're talking about managing your art assets. What made you decide to tuck a little, how to take care of things chapter into your larger book? It's a little unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely because of my background in wealth management, but also I'm afraid of disasters.
So are we.
So I remember back in 2012, and Sandy hurricane hit New York City. And I was I collect watches and wine, so I have a small circle of wine collectors I talk to. And one of them told me his very close friend had been storing about $100,000 of champagne in a Chelsea storage, and it was flooded, and he had no insurance. And I thought, wow, why would you store $100,000 of champagne outside your home and not insure it? But there are many art collectors who begin with one piece turns into 10, and 10 turns into 20, and 20 turns into 50, and they don't think about collection management, and they haven't had the conversation about protecting their work. And so I didn't want to sound like I was advising them on collection management, but I just wanted to introduce the idea and let them know that it's not about the art as a commodity, but understanding the value of what you purchase and what it's worth, and protecting it is important. And what if you bought an Alteron's Gumby for $10,000 and soon it's worth $100,000, and you never reevaluated your insurance, and then a disaster struck and hit your home, and you had a flood or a leak, or then you go back to his gallery and talk to the artist for him to recreate a work, and it's no longer $10,000, now it's $100,000. Now you have to spend $100,000 to replace that work. But if you were properly insured, you wouldn't have that issue. And so that was really the point I was making for collectors, to just understand their collection and be informed about the value of their collection and protecting it.
No, it is incredibly important, and certainly what we see a lot of is not only the flooding, like you mentioned, but also, we're here, we're drinking champagne, attending panels, you buy something, and then really it's very important to make sure it gets shipped correctly so that when you receive it in a week, it doesn't arrive.
In fact, I curated a show in Los Angeles, and one of the paintings came to the exhibition damaged. But we had insurance, and that wasn't an issue. It was a slight issue for the artist because he was a little annoyed with the shipping issue, but it was fixed.
Yeah, no.
I'm actually in the process of writing a memoir. Between 2016 and 2019, I ran 19 marathons, including Chicago. And I'm writing a memoir about that experience, and I hope it'll come out in November.
Well, great. We've got the temptation of the next novel, but luckily we have lots of examples of the current book here. So maybe that's a great segue to all of you being able to meet Charles and have him sign a book if you would like a copy. So thank you so much. It's a treat to have a conversation with a friend on a stage.
Thank you, and thank you all.